November 9th, 1989, East Berlin. The autumn air was crisp and electric with tension, as Harald Jäger stood at his post at Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous crossing point in the divided city of Berlin. For 28 years, this concrete barrier had split not just a city, but an entire world into two opposing ideologies. Jäger had spent years watching desperate people attempt to cross this deadly divide. Some successful, many not. Tonight felt different. The crowd pressing against the checkpoint had swelled to thousands, their voices creating a thunderous chorus that echoed off the cold concrete walls. "Open the gate! Open the gate!" they chanted, their breath visible in the cold night air. Behind them, more people streamed in from every direction. Workers still in their factory uniforms, elderly couples who hadn't seen their grandchildren in decades, young lovers separated by ideology and concrete. Jäger's radio crackled with increasingly frantic messages from his superiors, but the orders were contradictory, confused, desperate. No one in the East German government knew what to do. The crowd pressed closer, their faces filled with hope, desperation, and something Jäger had rarely seen in East Berlin: defiance. These weren't revolutionaries or dissidents. These were ordinary people who had simply reached their breaking point. The weight of 28 years of division, of families torn apart, of dreams deferred, had finally become too much to bear. Tonight, history was demanding its due. Earlier that day, in a sterile government building in East Berlin, a single moment of bureaucratic confusion had set in motion events that would reshape the world. Günter Schabowski, a mid-level East German official, sat nervously before a room packed with international journalists for what was supposed to be a routine press conference. The government had been under intense pressure for months as the Soviet Union under Gorbachev loosened its grip on Eastern Europe. Hungary had already opened its borders, and East Germans were fleeing by the thousands through other countries. The government needed to appear responsive while maintaining control. Schabowski had been handed new regulations about travel permissions just minutes before the conference began. The rules were complex, filled with bureaucratic language about applications and waiting periods. But as questions flew from the packed room of reporters, Schabowski made a fatal mistake. When asked when the new travel regulations would take effect, he shuffled through his papers nervously, sweat beading on his forehead under the hot television lights. "Immediately," he said, misreading his notes. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for phones and rushed to file their stories. Within an hour, news broadcasts across both East and West Berlin were announcing that the borders were open. Radio waves carried the impossible message into homes where families had been separated for nearly 3 decades. People who had given up hope of ever seeing their loved ones again suddenly found themselves grabbing coats and heading for the checkpoints, not entirely believing it could be true, but unable to stay away. At the wall itself, the atmosphere had transformed from tense anticipation to barely controlled chaos. Harald Jäger found himself at the center of a moment that would define not just his life, but the course of history. The crowd had grown to over 10,000 people, pressing against the barriers with a determination that was both peaceful and unstoppable. Behind him, his fellow guards looked to him for guidance, their training having never prepared them for anything like this. The standing orders were clear: no one passes without proper documentation and approval. But the crowd wasn't just asking anymore, they were demanding. Families held photographs of relatives they hadn't seen in decades. Elderly people leaned on walking sticks, having traveled from across East Germany for this moment. Young people linked arms, their voices strong with songs of unity and freedom. Jäger could see the desperation and hope in their faces, and something inside him began to crack. This wasn't about politics or ideology anymore. This was about basic human dignity, about the fundamental right to move freely, to see family, to live without concrete and barbed wire defining the boundaries of possibility. At 10:30 p.m., with the crowd still growing and his superiors still failing to provide clear orders, Jäger made the decision that would echo through history. He turned to his fellow guards and said simply, "We can't hold them back anymore. Open it." The barrier rose with a mechanical whir that was almost drowned out by the explosion of cheers from the crowd. The first person through was Dieter Knabe, a young engineer who had been separated from his grandmother for 28 years. As he stepped through the checkpoint, tears streaming down his face, thousands more surged forward into a future none of them had dared to imagine just hours before. What happened next transformed from celebration to revolution in the span of hours. Word spread through both sides of Berlin like electricity through water. Within hours, all the checkpoints along the wall were overwhelmed. East and West Berliners flooded toward the concrete barrier that had defined their lives for nearly 3 decades. The wall, which had once been patrolled by guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross, was suddenly surrounded by jubilant crowds armed with hammers, pickaxes, chisels, and anything else that could chip away at the concrete. The sound was incredible. Thousands of people attacking the wall simultaneously created a percussion that could be heard for miles. People took turns with hammers, passing them to whoever wanted to take a swing at the symbol of their oppression. Families who had been separated for decades embraced through holes in the wall that grew larger by the hour. Bottles of champagne appeared as if from nowhere, passed from hand to hand through the crowds. Strangers hugged and danced together on top of the wall itself, the same structure that had meant certain death to approach just days before. Television crews from around the world captured images that would become iconic. People wielding sledgehammers against the concrete, families crying as they reunited, young people spray painting messages of freedom on sections of wall still standing. The East German guards, overwhelmed and receiving no coherent orders, simply stepped aside and watched as history rewrote itself before their eyes. What had been built as the ultimate symbol of division was being transformed into the ultimate symbol of unity and human determination. By dawn, entire sections of the wall had been reduced to rubble, and souvenir hunters were already collecting pieces of concrete that would soon be sold around the world as tangible pieces of this incredible moment in human history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was just the beginning of a cascade of changes that would reshape the entire world order. Within weeks, the East German government collapsed, unable to maintain legitimacy after their most powerful symbol of control had been literally torn apart by the people. The reunification of Germany, which had seemed like an impossible dream just months before, suddenly became an inevitability. But the implications reached far beyond Germany's borders. The fall of the wall sent shockwaves throughout the Soviet bloc, inspiring peaceful revolutions across Eastern Europe. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond, people saw that change was possible, that the seemingly permanent structures of oppression could crumble in a matter of hours. The Soviet Union itself, already struggling under the weight of economic problems and political reform, found its authority fatally undermined. Within 2 years, the USSR would cease to exist, ending the Cold War that had defined global politics for nearly half a century. The Berlin Wall, which had been built in 1961 as the ultimate expression of the Iron Curtain, had instead become the catalyst for its complete destruction. Today, most of the wall is gone, existing only in museums and in the memories of those who lived through its shadow. But its fall remains one of history's most powerful reminders that no barrier built by human hands is stronger than the human spirit's desire for freedom and unity. In the end, it wasn't armies or governments that brought down the Berlin Wall. It was ordinary people with hammers, and an unshakable belief that walls meant to divide us are ultimately temporary, while the connections that unite us as human beings are eternal.